Song for a Whale, Chapter 9. On the way to Oak Manor to visit Grandma on Saturday, Tristan touched my shoulder and signed, "Hungry?" He smiled like something was funny. "Actually, I was starving." "Yeah, why?" "Your stomach is rumbling like an airplane engine." I covered my stomach with my hands to muffle the sound and smiled back at him. "I doubt that. An airplane engine is over 100 decibels. However loud a stomach rumble was, it had to be a lot less than that." That morning, I'd been too nervous to eat breakfast. Normally, I was excited to visit Grandma. Other than Wendell, she was the only deaf person I got to talk to anymore. Lately, it was like I needed a bridge to get to her. One of us would say something, then the conversation would fizzle out, and we were back to sitting there trying to come up with something else to say. It used to be that when I got together with my grandparents, we'd sign nonstop, catching up on everything in our lives and laughing at our own jokes and stories that made sense only in sign language. Maybe Grandpa had been our bridge, and we didn't notice it until he was gone. Grandma had moved to Oak Manor just a few weeks earlier. Before that, she still lived in the house she'd shared with Grandpa for forever. One day, about a month after Grandpa died, she didn't answer the door when we went to visit her. She didn't reply to text messages either. Her car wasn't in the garage. We let ourselves in with the spare key that Mom had, then searched the house. I checked the study. On her desk was a lamp I'd made her out of an old wine bottle. I'd filled it with shells and sea glass, and we'd found at the beach. Next to that was a picture of Grandpa and me building a sandcastle. "Grandma, where are you?" I looked up then at a framed picture on the wall and felt like she was teasing me with an answer. Below the picture of a whale swimming in the ocean was a quote from her favorite book, Moby Dick. "I know not all that may be coming, but be it what it will, I'll go to it laughing." I found Mom in Grandma's room, sitting on the bed with her phone. "Maybe she's at the beach," I suggested. Mom shook her head. "She never drives that far. I'm checking with her friends to see if they know anything. I'm sure she's fine." Before she pulled me in for a hug, I caught the expression on her face. It matched the worry I felt. Dad finally called the police. An hour later, the police called back. They found Grandma more than 100 miles away at the Gulf Coast, walking the stretch of the beach where we used to live. After she got back home, she tried to explain that she'd left because she was like Ishmael in Moby Dick. Sometimes she had too much of a drizzly November in her soul and had to get to the sea. She used to travel with Grandpa all the time, she said, and everyone should stop making such a big deal over it. "Why didn't you at least tell us where you're going?" Mom asked her. "Because you would have talked me out of it." No one argued with that. Mom finally convinced her to move to Oak Manor, which was an apartment complex for old people. Grandma said the house was too big for one person to take care of anyways, so she'd go. I didn't believe her. She looked like she just didn't feel strong enough to keep fighting. Sometimes that was the easier choice. My parents promised to take her to the beach in the summer, maybe when they weren't so busy with work. Sometimes I worried that Grandma wouldn't make it until summer. Her November had gone on for 3 months already, and it seemed like she might be stuck there wandering and shivering forever. So there was something I couldn't fix. Before we went through the sliding glass doors at Oak Manor, Mom gave me a tight hug that lasted a few seconds longer than most. Then she stepped back and smoothed my hair and signed, "I love you." She did that every time we visited Grandma, just to me, never to Tristan. Love you too, Mom. Tristan and I headed upstairs with Dad while Mom went to the social worker's office to ask if Grandma was making friends yet. It was almost noon when we got to Grandma's apartment, but she looked like she just rolled out of bed. She wore a pair of sweatpants and a gray t-shirt she'd probably slept in. After giving each of us a hug, she invited us to come in and sit down. "Where's Mom?" she asked. "She'll be up in a minute," I answered, talking to the staff downstairs. Grandma smiled. "About your uncooperative grandmother?" "So that's where Iris gets it." Dad laughed at his own joke. Grandma sat next to me on the couch and asked, "How's school?" "The same," I answered. "Sorry to hear that." She turned to my dad and sighed. Maybe Iris could transfer to Bridgewood and be around other deaf students. She signed slowly for my dad and used her voice too. She could hear a little, and people who knew her could mostly understand what she said. And Dad never had learned sign language very well. He could get by okay, but it wasn't like we could have a real conversation. I didn't expect him to know it as well as Mom. She had deaf parents, so she was signing before she could talk. I just wished he'd put more effort into learning it. He said he'd always been more of a numbers person than a words person, and that it was hard to learn a new language. Seems like having a kid you could barely talk to would be harder. I held my breath, wondering if Dad might agree with her. Bridgewood was a district with a big deaf education program, about 20-minute drive from our neighborhood. Deaf kids, like my friend Wendell, from 3 school districts went there. But Mom insisted on me going to Timber Oaks with all my neighborhood friends. I pointed out to her that I didn't have any of those anyway, but it didn't help. She wanted to stick with the plan she'd come up with when we first moved to town. Once in a while, Grandma brought up my going to Bridgewood. Maybe Dad would agree with her this time. Without Mom there to say I should keep going to school with the same people I'd been with all along. Dad didn't seem to care much either way. If he thought Grandma had a good idea, maybe he'd mention it to Mom later. Dad said something while throwing in a couple of signs like think and ship, and then waved his hand. From what I could piece together from the signs and what I read on his mouth, it was something like, "I think that ship has sailed." He used figures of speeches all the time, even though most of them didn't make sense. In sign language. Usually, I could figure out what he meant, like if I'd read the phrase in a book or it was one he said a lot. Once in a while, an English expression was similar to one in sign language. Like, if you pretend you're pulling a hair from your head, that's like the English phrase, by a hair. Usually they didn't match up so nicely. "What do you mean?" I didn't see why he thought it was too late for me to switch school districts. Why should I stay in the same place just because I'd been there for so long? "Nothing," Dad signed. "It's not important." He looked at Grandma and said, "Iris has gotten used to her school." Heat rushed to my face. I probably looked sunburned. This was a conversation about my school, and Dad wanted to leave me out of it. Even worse than talking around me was talking about me like I wasn't there. "Really?" Grandma asked. She didn't look like she was waiting for an answer. Her eyes shifted over to me. I leaned forward and waved my arm so Dad would look at me again. "It's important to me. You know, it's like train gone," signed Tristan. "I know that," I signed. I meant, why is Dad saying that about school? "Train?" Dad asked. I almost had to sit on my hands to keep from answering. Nothing. It's not important. Remember? That's how you do that phrase in sign language, Tristan answered. Instead of saying, that ship has sailed, or you missed the boat. I've shown you that before, I told Dad, but that's not the point. Why had that ship sailed? I'd be starting junior high next year anyway. Might as well hop on the next boat, or train, or whatever, with people I could talk to. Mom walked in then with some flyers. Hi, Mom. She signed and came over to the couch to give Grandma a hug. Grandma gave her a small smile and signed. I know. I'm in trouble. You're not in trouble, Mom said, but I was hoping you'd be socializing more. It isn't good for you to be by yourself all the time. Tristan sat on the floor in front of the couch and took a flyer from Mom. I know, Grandma said. I've never felt like doing anything. I'll get out sometime. Look, Tristan pointed out some events on the calendar. They have a lot of stuff going on. Movie nights, games, a field trip to the zoo. Nothing's the same without Grandpa. One reason my parents suggested Oak Manor to Grandma. Besides, all the staff who'd helped keep an eye on her was that there was a deaf group who did things together. She chatted with a couple of them, but that was it. Grandma and Grandpa always seemed so outgoing, so fun. All that had drained out of her now that he wasn't around anymore. They'd met in college, where they were in a deaf theater group together. Sometimes the plays they performed were all in sign language, and they'd have interpreters speaking the parts for the sign language impaired. Other times, they interpreted plays for the school. After rehearsing for weeks with the cast, they were so good at bringing a play to life that it wasn't just deaf people in the audience who loved watching them. Everyone did. That was what they'd told me anyway. Mom brushed a lock of Grandma's hair back with her hand. You're not taking care of yourself. She found a hairbrush in the bathroom, then sat on the other side of Grandma and motioned for her to turn toward me so she could brush her hair. Grandma's hair had been a long, silvery waterfall for as long as I could remember. All the tangles in it that day made me wonder how long it had been since she brushed it. I rubbed the lightning bolt Z on my necklace. There we were again, so close, but with the Gulf of Mexico between us. Maybe there was a way Grandpa could still bridge us together. Handshake game? I asked. Grandma shook her head. Oh, that was Grandpa's thing. And now, it'll be our thing. I waited, ready for her to argue back. Okay, what shape? I held up my index fingers. Grandma nodded and motioned for me to start. I looked up and drew the sun in the sky, squinting to show its brightness. Grandma looked up too, then shook her head and put a finger to her lips. There is no sun. Fine, then it'd be nighttime. I showed a star in the sky. Grandma added, it's the only star. Why couldn't I have picked any other shape, one that wouldn't lend itself to such lonely signs? I wanted to erase everything and then open my hands to show a sky full of stars, but that would break the pattern I'd started. I'd make it work. I looked up as if I could see it. No, there's a shooting star. I drew its path zipping across the sky. Grandma showed the shooting star traveling farther and farther away. She pointed to the first star, alone in the sky again. My turn. 2 people walked together side by side. One of them pointed out the star, and they both looked up and smiled. On Grandma's turn, one of those people flew up to the sky to join that star, leaving the other person all alone. I didn't want the game to end that way. Leaving that person standing on Earth all alone watching a star? but I couldn't think of what else to add to the story. I lost.